Hey there, Internet. This is Brandon. I'm back to talk to you a little bit about a new project that we're starting up, a couple patterns that we're implementing on a web API project. So the thing we're showing off is basically a simple API that's secured. It'll be a little bit of a series. We're going to get into some patterns that we've used implementing MediatR, some exception-driven responses, dependency injection, things like that in .NET Core 2.2. So let's dive into it and have some fun. Okay, so here's what we're working with. Um, Basically, I spit this out using the typical .NET new command. This is what would come with any new .NET Web API project. You have the values controller, although you'll see that I've edited a little bit here. But basically what we're doing is making things a little more simple. So where controllers tend to get a little bloated with dependencies here, we've thinned things out a little bit, and I'll show you how that works. And then generally speaking, how do we get from our dependencies, which might be databases, might be services, whatever those are, to responding to our client with an appropriate HTTP response. So in this case, we're using MediatR. MediatR does a really good job abstracting the logic that we're using for each one of our controller actions into their own classes. So in this case, we have a bunch of queries and commands that we're receiving as the API, and then we're responding to those, and they're called requests. But in this case, it's a little bit of a CQRS pattern because you can send commands up that would be separate from the way you might query them back down, and we'll show you that in the controller. But generally, the separation is now every bit of logic that you have as far as querying your database or potentially updating your database is all going to be encapsulated in this handle method within this request that MediatR uses. So you'll notice back in our values controller, very, very simple. All this does is we define our endpoint, we have a route, and then we call MediatR, and we call with a new instance of that command or query. And then MediatR goes and says, hey, who implements me, and picks that implementation and then runs the code and returns anything that's within its return type. We really like that again because you have the iMediatR input here as a parameter to your values controller, most controllers, and then you can independently manage the uh, the dependencies as far as, for example, here we're using an iValues service that I'm injecting into this query handler because that's what I want to use. That doesn't end up going in your controller and start adding up into a bunch of DI issues that you might run into. So that's a common problem we're solving. Another problem we're solving is how to turn these into appropriate response codes. So what we're going to do is go to our base controller. So base implementation here, it's an API controller. We added a base route. So basically everything's going to go through root/API/ the controller, and then you can implement routes on top of that. That exception filter here is the key. So basically what's happening is my code, I'll show you an example. Let's say we have a service that is attempting to post a duplicate value that we're adding to the collection of strings that come with the general implementation of the values controller. If we detect a duplicate, I'm going to throw an exception, conflict exception. We want that to translate to a 409. So what we do in our base controller is we basically map, if I throw a conflict exception, return a conflict exception object result, which actually does by default return a 409 to the client. So you're actually not handling this because it's a generic kind of global case. You're not handling any of this in your controllers. It gets very thin. You don't have to care about action results and things like that. We're doing all that in the background. What you have to worry about is making sure that you're mapping your endpoint to a query or command to invoke MediatR appropriately. I'm gonna post this code up at GitHub. First of all, I'll show you a quick. This is MediatR by a guy named Jimmy Bogard. Give it a look. MEDIATR on GitHub, and then additionally, I'm putting up a separate repository that I'll link out to, just so you have access to the code to take a look. But in general, this has been a really simple implementation for us, just to start it up and show you in an action. This is .NET Core, by the way, if that wasn't clear. Probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. So again, we have localhost 5000. That's where our server's listening /API/values controller, and it's returning a collection of values. Now I can get this either by its index. Now I have, of course, error handling because I don't have anything at 2. So value 1 here. And then we can also post. One thing I want to show off as well is if you're posting to values, there's a body where one of the fields is value. And let me show you what that's actually doing, because that's another interesting implementation. So again, we're getting a 200. If I do it again, you're going to get a 409 because that's already there. One of the interesting things we've done here is we figured out that you can actually you could actually bind to models directly from controller methods. So that actual command is bound that way and then just passed on to MediatR like anything else. Just to show you what that looks like. That's the value that we're passing through. We made it required for obvious reasons. Anyway, so that's the code. I'll post this and send you a link, and please feel free to reach out with any questions. Just wanted to give you a really quick overview about what we're using and why we like using it. Thanks for listening.